Well, thank you for having me here. My name's indeed B. Kothuis. In Texas, Baukje and Kothuis becomes Baukje Kothuis, and then everybody forgets it. So I'm the chief representative of, for the Dutch government in Texas. I'm a design anthropologist by trade, and from that role also related to Delft University and Texas A&M University for the past, well, 10, 12 years, I think. I've facilitated dozens of exchanges within the triple helix from both sides of the Atlantic, and but actually all related to flood risk management, resilience, design, etc. And in the picture you see the location of my post in orange circle, and the other big white circle is, you may recognize as Hurricane Ian, the one that recently ravaged the other side of the Gulf of Mexico. And hurricanes are actually a key element in anything that has to do with designing infrastructure in this area. And well, the request to me by Carola was to compare and contrast Houston and Rotterdam. So let's start with looking at the Netherlands and Texas. Are they actually comparable? Well, at first sight, you would probably say not. But when you take a little bit different perspective, you might, maybe there is some comparison. And then on a little bit smaller scale, when we look to Rotterdam and Houston, it seems like there is some similarities. We see the new waterway in this beautiful picture on the left-hand side. And then on the right, the inland part of the Houston Ship Channel, looking towards the city center of Houston, and with the typical petrochemical objects up front. And when we look at the layout of the two ship channels, there's several differences. Of course, both ship channels go inland, but that's in fact only part of the Houston Ship Channel. The largest part of that ship channel is actually through Galveston Bay, and thus more or less in open water. From the Gulf to Mexico, it passes between the two barrier islands. I actually live in Galveston on that island, so I'm catching the hurricanes there. And then towards the port of Houston. And in contrast to the new waterway, the new waterway had to be dug out in the mid-1900s. The Houston Ship Channel was always part of existing waterways through the Galveston Bay and inland as part of the Buffalo Bayou. And what is called improvements of the Houston Ship Channel was for the most of the past century and a half based on economic drivers, in particular the size of the vessels that had to reach the port. The developments in Houston that started with the facilitating the quays and the Buffalo Bayou, so the inland part for the shallow barges and mainly the cotton trade. I'm very grateful to Dominic to explain all this already, so that's really nice, because Galveston Bay was and is actually only about 10 feet deep on average. And it meant that when cargo loads increased and requested for larger ships, the cargo had to be reloaded at the city of Galveston from or into deeper, larger deep sea vessels. So the city of Galveston actually had a lot of power and could impose tolls and control a lot around the shipping to Houston. And after half a century, this competition was actually at its peak. But the year 1900 brought big changes, and Dominic also mentioned it. It was both human and nature-induced. First of all, the first Texas oil field was discovered in Spindletop. It literally spewed out of the earth there. And then nature came to the aid of Houston, in fact, because the great hurricane of 1900 literally smashed Galveston, and it's up to today the deadliest natural disaster in the US, with over 8,000 deaths, some say 12,000, and the port of Galveston was actually literally wiped out. So Houston seized that opportunity and started lobbying in DC for money, and for the first time ever in the United States, the federal government funded a local state project, the deepening and the widening of the Houston Ship Channel through the bay and into the bayou. And this so-called Project 5, all the ship channel improvement projects are referred to as numbers, was completed in 1914, and Houston was then officially established as a deep water port. I will not bore you with all the details, and Dominic told a lot of all these projects, but you can see that the next oil boom that called again for access for larger ships, and again in World War II, the same thing with the big warships, that all induced deepening and widening of the Houston Ship Channel. Economy and ship size driven, remember that one. Then I took a very quick look into the development of the new waterway to compare, and it seems that the drivers for change are quite the same here over the past 150 years. Vessels becoming larger and needing a wider and deeper channel for access. And the final adjustment was completed in 2018 or 19, I think, accommodating impressive vessels like this Delta Mariner. Both ship channels are in parts of the world where flood risk is at stake. Interestingly, in both locations, the flood protection strategy seems to start aligning as well, where the Dutch have installed their delta works after the 1953 disaster. The Texans are currently working on the coastal protection plan that was after Hurricane Ike designed, and it was approved on a federal level at the end of last year. And indeed, out of the several initiatives and alternatives, the strategy of shortening the coastline was chosen as the preferred alternative. Shortening the coastline in the Netherlands affected the ship channel with a storm surge barrier placed in its course. Notice the logo of the 50-year anniversary of the New Waterway, where in fact that there was no obstacles in the ship channel, no bridges nor sluices, is specifically acknowledged. See here that shortening the coastline in Texas will also affect the Houston ship channel. Interestingly enough, for the access to Galveston Bay, we see a similar plan with storm surge barriers. And of course, everything's bigger in Texas. That's our logo or our slogan. So the preliminary design contains not only one, but two Maceland barriers, plus half an Easter Scheldt barrier and two Hartel keringen. So, well, the Houston ship channel is no doubt affected by those constructions. The width and the depth of the openings will play a major role in the future of the port. And of course, the effects of hurricanes, which will become more drastic as a result of future changing conditions, as it's called in Texas, or climate change, as we usually call it, sea level rise, and especially the increasing frequency and strength of hurricanes, that may mean that the barrier will have to close more frequently, and thus obstructing the passage of vessels to Houston. And this is an effect that we also recognize in the new waterway. With the Maceland barrier, climate change and especially sea level rise will mean that the closure regime of the barrier will change, and an estimated 1.5 meter rise may result in closing almost every 10 days on average. Well, that triggers other ideas, other values, other stakeholders getting involved, and which in turn requires input from other disciplines. So enter landscape architects, planners, ecologists, etc. And look here, the Galveston Bay Park Plan, an alternative for hurricane storm surge protection consisting of islands made by dredged material, primarily protecting the port and the densely populated west coast of Galveston Bay, instead of shortening the coastline. New disciplines like landscape architects bring new narratives, new styles of images, as you no doubt note here. And this case also seems a great opportunity to capitalize on emotion, the ship channel pride. Let's do something amazing again, which is pretty radical for some other emotions, because the barrier islands are now left unprotected, which, you know, of course, triggers some unease in Galveston, especially after the 1900 Houston port takeover. The Galveston Bay Park Plan links to Project 11, which is the latest addition to the Houston Ship Channel improvement projects. Incidentally, history repeats itself here. In this project, the Federal US Army Corps and the local port again worked together, but now the port took the lead. And it's fascinating to see how the same images can emphasize very different values. See the dredger here representing the widening of the channel. And then in the Galveston Bay Park Plan, the dredger is also pretty prominent, but now representing the formation of new islands along the ship channel, and I cite, to create and sustain bay habitat and recreational facilities. Here we see the input from other values than just the economic and the technical. Values like incorporation of the ship channel into the landscape and environment, how nature and ecology play a role in it, the added value for local residents' quality of life in the form of recreation. And we see it stated here, and I cite again, a symbiotic relationship between the economic drivers of the region and its natural environment. And this brings other perspectives, other stakeholders to the table, and requires other expertise than pure technical design. And those experts also bring, among other things, a very different style of renderings and presentation, sometimes quite extreme, as you see here, this other imaging and narrative. And another great example of how input from landscape architects, planner, environmental ecology specialists also play a role in how the designs are shaped is the logo of the port that's incorporated into the design of the dredged material islands. And I think before was also said that, you know, this can also be a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Multi-value, multidisciplinary expertise. This mode of designing requires the input and cooperation of many more stakeholders than before. And well-functioning stakeholder management is something we in the Netherlands pride ourselves on as a method that, you know, where we have multiple examples that work in relation to the new waterway, for example, Maasvlakte 2. But I see this here now everywhere in Texas as well. For example, a joint effort across various federal, state, and local agencies helped to bring Project 11 to life. And we saw that with the Project 11 dredge kickoff celebration this June, which brought about 200 stakeholders and elected officials together to commemorate the kickoff for this $1 billion project. Ecology and other landscape integration linked to future changing conditions and drawn up from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds can also be seen at a new waterway. In this case, fitted into the existing system from a collaboration between Rijkswaterstaat, Rotterdam Municipality, Boskalis, the startup Reefy, that actually is also coming to Texas, and the World Wildlife Fund. This project creates in the new waterway an artificial reef that reduces the force of waves and provides habitat for numerous animals and will also improve biodiversity and water quality. And finally, this wonderful design that Han brought to my attention, and which of course you all know. It's a completely different vision of dealing with future changing conditions around the new waterway that will have enormous impact on that new waterway. And the takeaways from this, well, drivers for ship channel improvement, mainly based on purely economic values and the size of ships, are more and more supplemented by new drivers related to climate change, other future changing conditions, and a livable environment for humans and ecology. That means multi-value, multi-stakeholders, and the input of multidisciplinary, it asks for the input of multidisciplinary expertise. And to throw the bat in, I put the bat in the henhouse. I don't know if that is an expression in English as well, maar de knuppel in het hoenderhok. One question is concerning the Houston Ship Channel: is biggest really the way to resilience to future changing circumstances? Climate change, energy transition, etc. Should the ever-increasing size of vessels dictate that future? Despite the slogan of Texas, everything's bigger in Texas, I also really notice a sentiment in the other direction. If this region is to remain resilient over the long time, perhaps it's needed to think smaller, and instead of betting everything on one big port that will impact the whole country and more in case of failure, perhaps choose to spread the risk along several smaller ports and that are easier accessible along the coast. And at any rate, I saw last week at the Breakbulk trade event in Houston that the port of Freeport is already anticipating on this. Change your channel, they say. Well, thank you for your attention.